Now, this near monopoly on rare earth elements allows China to use access to these materials as a diplomatic tool. So, China's control over these rare earth elements, they can actually destabilize South Asian economies.
Namaste and welcome to our second episode of our podcast series, Understanding Asian Hydropolitics through 5 questions, brought to you by Asian Confluence, and I'm your host, Neeraj. I'm thrilled to dive into another critical topic shaping Asia's geopolitical landscape. So, in this episode, we are exploring a topic that extends beyond water but remains deeply tied to resource politics, rare earth resources, and the rise of China's extractive diplomacy. As usual, we will unpack this through 5 thought provoking questions designed to spark clarity and conversation. And I'm delighted to join today by Dr. Sriparna Pathak, who is a professor of China Studies and director of Center of Northeast Asian Studies at Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University, Haryana. Dr. Pathak is a leading expert in China foreign policy and international relations with a doctorate from Center of East Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has authored numerous work, including her recent book, Drifts and Dynamics, Russia's Ukraine War and Northeast Asia, and has served as a consultant for the Ministry of External Affairs, focusing on China's domestic and foreign policy. Dr. Pathak, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Neeraj, for having me here. And it's always wonderful discussing with you. And I look forward to the questions today.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. So let us start by setting the stage. China's grip on rare earth element production has given it a very unique kind of a global influence, often described as a strategic chokehold. So how this control shaped China's foreign policy, particularly towards the resource dependent countries in the global scale. How do you see it?
So, China has a near monopoly on rare earth elements, and these rare earth elements are critical for high tech industries, which includes electronics, renewable energies, defense. Now, this near monopoly on rare earth elements allows China to use access to these materials as a diplomatic tool. For global south countries that are reliant on rare earth elements for industrial development or even for exports, China employs a resource diplomacy to secure favorable agreements. Just to give you a few examples, in terms of trade and investment incentives, China often offers access to rare earth elements in exchange for infrastructure deals or trade agreements or political alignment. For example, African countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which supplies cobalt and other minerals, they have seen increased Chinese investment in mining and infrastructure, which is often tied to rare earth element access. Now, China also integrates rare earth elements supply chains to its BRI projects, offering resource dependent countries loans or infrastructure in return for long term mineral supply contracts. So, this strengthens economic ties, creates dependency on Chinese supply chains. So, by controlling this supply, China can influence global rare earth element prices. This impacts the economic stability of the resource dependent countries. Just to give you an example, in 2010, there were temporary export restrictions, and that caused price hikes, pressured countries like Japan when the Senkaku Islands dispute happened, and it actually signaled China's ability to disrupt the markets. So, China goes on to cultivate alliances with resource rich but economically vulnerable countries, and it offers rare earth elements and their supplies to secure access to other critical minerals. Examples are those of, say, lithium in Bolivia or copper in Zambia. This fosters political alignment, as one has seen in China's growing influence in Africa and in Latin America. And then there is, of course, coercive diplomacy. It restricts rare earth exports to assert its geopolitical pressure. I just mentioned the embargo in 2010 on Japan when there was a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands. That was just one example as to how China weaponizes this monopoly over rare earth elements, and it gives a signal to other countries the risks of opposing Beijing's interests. It also counters the Western influence. Because when China offers rare earth elements and investments to global South countries, China is positioning itself as an alternative to Western powers, framing its partnerships as free of the conditionalities imposed by institutions like the IMF or World Bank. But it's not as simple as it looks, because one has to tacitly align with Beijing's political interests, its political demands, and so on. So, these, in a nutshell, these are the few ways in which it leverages this sort of a stronghold or chokehold over the mining and export of rare earth minerals, and how it leverages into its geopolitical ambitions.
So that's a very fantastic perspective. China's rare earth leveraging really seems to act as a both carrot and a stick in its diplomacy. And you have rightly mentioned about all these points. And it's very interesting dynamic for such a resource-scarce nation. So let's dig deeper into the concept you have just touched upon. You have mentioned about how the China uses resources very much strategically, and how do you define this extractive diplomacy? In what ways the China has institutionalized, I would say, this kind of a practice across all the Africa or the Latin America or the Southeast Asia?
So, extractive diplomacy is a sort of foreign policy strategy wherein a state leverages its control over critical natural resources, which includes rare earth elements, of course, or even minerals or energy, in order to secure economic, geopolitical, and diplomatic advantages. So, this sort of an approach, it involves offering access to resources, investment, infrastructure in exchange for political alignment or long-term resource supply contracts or strategic concessions from resource dependent or resource rich countries. What it does is that it preys on asymmetric relationships wherein the resource controlling state exploits the dependency to advance its own interests, sometimes fostering economic reliance or debt traps in partner countries. So, in China's case, extractive diplomacy is a cornerstone of its global strategy. It's used its dominance in rare earth elements, about 60 to 70% of global production, 80 to 90% of refining, in order to deepen its influence, particularly in the global south. Just to give you the examples, you had mentioned Africa. Now, Africa is extremely rich in minerals like cobalt, lithium, copper, and that's a focal point for China's extractive diplomacy because it's driven by the need to secure resources in industrial and green energy sectors. If you look at the BRI, which was launched in 2013, it's a key institutional framework and it channels about $150 billion of investments to Africa. And this is the statistic as of 2023. And these are for mining, for ports, and for infrastructure. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which supplies 70% of global cobalt, China's CMOC group and others, they've invested at least $2.5 billion in the 10K Fungurume mine, and it has secured long-term cobalt supplies in exchange for roads, for power plants. Um, China has also employed what I call the Angola model deal, wherein resource, it's a resource, China is the resource-rich country, engages with certain countries wherein there has to be a repayment of loans with minerals. Angola, for instance, has used oil exports to settle $20 billion in Chinese loans for infrastructure, locking in long-term resource flows, right? Then, if you look at China's state-owned enterprises, companies like China's non-ferrous metal mining group and Zhejiang Mining, they operate under state guidance. They secure mining concessions in countries like Zambia for copper and Guinea for bauxite. And these firms align with Beijing's strategic goals. They ensure resource access while offering host countries infrastructure or jobs. Um, Now, using it as diplomatic leverage, just to give you another example, some of these African countries which are reliant on Chinese investment, say for example like Zimbabwe, they often back China in international forums. For example, on United Nations votes on human rights issues and so on. Now, what China does is that it prioritizes speed over environmental standards. It leads to a lot of local backlash, of course, But local backlash is different from what a government's approach would be, right? But just to give you an example, in Madagascar, rare earth exploration by Chinese firms have led to a lot of protests over environmental degradation. That highlights the risks of extractive diplomacy. Just to come to a few examples from Latin America, again, Latin America also has vast reserves of lithium, of copper, of iron ore, and that's another key region for China's extractive diplomacy so that it can support its electric vehicle and renewable energy industries. So there's a lithium triangle in Latin America made of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. And China has secured significant stakes in lithium, which is critical for electronic vehicle batteries. And there's Tianqi Lithium's $4.1 billion worth of acquisition of a 24% stake in Chile's SQM in 2018. Then there is Canfeng Lithium's investments in Argentina's Cochari Olaroz project. All of these are examples of China's strategy to lock in supplies through equity stakes and offtake agreements. Um, Countries like Venezuela or Ecuador, they faced debt distress from Chinese loans, which are tied to oil exports. Venezuela has a $60 billion worth of debt, which is owed to China, which is repaid through oil, and that has given Beijing leverage over its energy policy. So, what China does is that by dominating these resource supply chains, China actually counters US influence in the region. And in, say, Brazil's iron ore sector, you can see this as well. Investments in Brazil's iron ore sector align with the efforts to diversify trade away from US led frameworks. Just to wrap this up with Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia is rich in nickel, in tin, and rare earth elements, all of which are critical for China's supply chains. Again, particularly for electronic vehicles, for electronics, for manufacturing. So, in the case of Indonesia, China has invested heavily in Indonesia's nickel sector, which supplies 50% of the global nickel. And there is Tsingshan Holding Group, which has $10 billion worth of investment in the Morowali Industrial Park. It includes smelters and power plants, secures nickel for China's battery industry, while offering Indonesia jobs and infrastructure. In Myanmar, Chinese firms like Shanghe Resources, they've explored rare earth element deposits, even though there's a lot of political instability and that has slowed progress. But the fact is that the investment is still there. In Vietnam, China has offered technical assistance for rare earth element processing. It tries to integrate Hanoi into its supply chain. This also extends China's regional influence, and its deals in Southeast Asia align with its South China Sea ambitions. It encourages countries like the Philippines to soften territorial disputes in exchange for economic benefits. So, at the surface, it looks like, okay, it's just investment, or, it's just about rare earth exports, rare earth elements. But it's a multi-layered, multi-pronged strategy, and it goes down into a lot of different levels.
Okay, so that's really a clear way to the framing this extractive diplomacy, and it's just not about resources you have just mentioned, but about building system of influences. And it's very eye-opening to see how China has embedded this in its global outreach. So let us now look at how this kind of a strategy is evolving. So with the global race towards energy transition and green technologies, to demand for the rare earth and the critical mineral is very much skyrocketing at the moment. So how is China is recalibrating its extractive strategies to maintain influence while avoiding the over exploitation or the backlash from the host countries? How do you see it?
So, there has been a backlash from countries, from host countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. So, what China has done is that it has very smartly adapted its strategies to balance resource control with sustainability concerns and geopolitical pressures. What it does is that in order to counter criticism of environmental degradation or of overexploitation, China has been trying to integrate sustainability into its extractive diplomacy, which looks like it's going to align with global green technology demands. For example, China has introduced stricter environmental regulations for its mining firms operating abroad, responding to host country backlash. For example, again going back to Africa, in Democratic Republic of Congo, the CMOC group, a major cobalt producer that has invested in tailings management and so on, or even Tenke Fungurume, in this particular mine, what this particular group has done is that it has said that they are now also investing in water treatment systems, or they are aiming at reducing pollution. Why have they said all of this? Because there have been certain local protests in 2023. What China also does is that, again, taking an example from Southeast Asia, in say Indonesia, the Tsingshan Holding Group, its nickel smelters in the Morowali Industrial Park, they are now incorporating energy efficient hydrometallurgy, and that's being promoted as a model for sustainable nickel production for EV batteries. In order to appeal to host countries' green agendas, China links mining projects to renewable energy infrastructure. Look, mining is mining and renewable energy is renewable energy, but China has very smartly managed to push out this perception or this narrative that there's a linkage between the two. Just to give you an example of this, in Chile, in Canfeng Lithium's solar powered facilities at the Cochari Olaroz lithium project, it is being projected that there's an alignment with local sustainability goals, so that there's a reduction in the opposition to Chinese operations. Beyond traditional partners, like say the DRC or Australia, what China is now also doing is that it's exploring rare earth energy and critical mineral deposits in countries like Greenland or Kazakhstan, etc. Just to give you an example, in 2024, Shanghai Resources, it went for a joint venture in Greenland's Kanafjeld REE project, and that was an attempt to showcase as to how China is engaging in diversification. It just does not want to, overexploit resources in a particular geographic region, right? So China is balancing its investments across regions. Africa remains critical, but China has increased lithium investments in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and so on. What it also does is that it is trying to showcase as to how it's refining the BRI and as to how it's refining financial mechanisms to align with host countries' development goals, host countries' sustainability goals, so that it can reduce the accusations of debt trap diplomacy or of engaging in more pollution. So it's showcasing as to how it's investing in local training, in education, that's spreading goodwill, right? So then the pushback for creating more pollution also reduces. In Bolivia, Chinese firms have actually funded mining engineering programs to position China as a partner in human capital development rather than just a purely extractive actor. So these are some of the steps to mitigate the pushback. But look, none of these are long term, and no one really knows as to how these are performing. All of these steps are very new, 2023 or 2024. The fact is that these projects were established, as part of the BRI, which was announced in 2013. It took 10 years for these sustainability programming to come in from the PRC side, and none of it has yet shown any results. Also, at the very outset, they look like very small steps, but they are done very smartly. They are projected as something so that the pushback reduces. So that's how it's going about it.
Influence with sustainability is no small feat, and it's very encouraging to hear about these shift, but it also raises a questions about vulnerabilities for other countries in the region. So let's turn our focus now closer to home. India and South Asian countries are also navigating a very complex relationship with China, especially as its resources influence grows. So, what risk do you see for India and its neighbors in the face of China's expanding its extractive diplomacy? Can we view China's resource-based partnership as a form of neo-colonial engagement? How do you see this kind of engagement?
So, to begin with, let's focus on India because it's the biggest out of all the other countries in South Asia. India relies heavily on China for rare earth elements and magnets. 93% of India's 57,000 ton magnet imports in the financial year of 24-25 are sourced from China. And other South Asian countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh, they also depend on Chinese minerals for manufacturing, for energy transitions. And in 2025, there have been certain export restrictions from China on rare earth exports. Examples include terbium and dysprosium. They've caused price hikes, price spikes, and in India, at least, that has been 5 to 8% for electronic vehicles. And there have been supply chain disruptions, industrial growth could be challenged, and so on. Now, China's resource for infrastructure deals leads to unsustainable debt. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is just one example, which is very well known. The Hambantota port got leased to China for 99 years in 2017 because Sri Lanka couldn't pay back $1.4 billion in debt. And that's just one example and one of the starkest ones. Then there is also Pakistan's $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor debt, which is tied to resource and to infrastructure projects. These also risk similar outcomes, and 40% of repayments from Pakistan are due by 2030. So China's control over these rare earth elements, they can actually destabilize South Asian economies. For example, Bangladesh's textile and electronics sector, they both face cost increases due to rare earth element supply constraints that will impact export competitiveness. For India, unfortunately, there's an underdeveloped rare earth element sector, which is 2,900 tons annually, versus 6 million tons in reserves. There's also a lack of refining capabilities that makes it vulnerable to Chinese supply manipulations. If this is the case for India, other South Asian countries lack significant rare earth element reserves in processing infrastructure or um, other sorts of infrastructure, which deepens the reliance on China. So China uses this resource access to influence South Asian politics. In the Maldives, for example, Chinese investments in infrastructure tied to resource trade have you know, pushed Mali close to Beijing. That's countered India's influence in the Indian Ocean. Similarly, Nepal's hydropower and mineral deals with China reduce its dependence on India. So, as opposed to the other parts of the globe wherein the great power competition is between US and China, within South Asia, the rivalry is between India and China. So, China's resource diplomacy actually exacerbates India-China tensions. Just to give you an example, these export curbs in 2025, even though they are aimed at the US, they indirectly pressure India. They give out a signal from China's side about its ability to disrupt India's defense and electronic vehicle sectors, among broader disputes along the line of actual control. Smaller South Asian countries, they face the pressure to align with China's geopolitical goals, such as supporting its South China Sea claims or voting for Beijing in international forums. Pakistan consistently backs China in any case at the UN. That's also to an extent tied to the CPEC and resource deals. These are all just examples of this dynamic. Now, India's defense sector is reliant on rare earth elements for missile systems, for drones, and that faces a risk from supply chain disruptions. So, other countries like Sri Lanka, they lack advanced defense industries, but are vulnerable to China's strategic port investment. So, this is actually a dual civil military sort of concern. Um, that being said, one also needs to look at long-term dependency because China's dominance in rare earth elements refining ensures that South Asian countries remain dependent on its processing capabilities, even if they develop domestic mining. Um, just to give an example, in India, the rare earth element production is limited to low value, light rare earth elements, and it requires Chinese refining for high value applications. China offers technical assistance, right, as has been the case in Bangladesh's electronic sector. That also goes on to create reliance on Chinese standards and equipment, which hinders technological sovereignty. These resource-based partnerships, they often favor China, and raw minerals exported are at low value, while processed goods are at extremely high cost. So that's quite a big problem. But I think at least in India, the awareness of this issue, the awareness has come in, even though it's a bit too late, but better late than never. So just to give you a few examples, in 2023, India has undertaken the 2023 Mines and Development and Regulation Amendment Act, which now allows private companies to explore non-radioactive rare earth elements. That has been aiming to boost domestic production. Three rare earth elements blocks have been auctioned in Karnataka, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. Then there's the National Critical Mineral Mission, which was launched in 2025. The initiative aims to enhance rare earth element self-reliance through exploration. And also, India is trying to diversify supply chains through partnerships with the US, with Australia, with Japan, with Kazakhstan. There's the India-US initiative on critical and emerging technology with the US. Then there's the India-Australia Critical Minerals Investment Partnership, and so on. There's also some sort of a collaboration, domestically. So in India, there are collaborations with the Bhabha Atomic Research Center and private firms like Numerous Motors, which all aim to develop rare earth element-free magnets and to recycle technologies. There are performance gaps, but at least some steps are being taken. But just to conclude the response to this question, the reliance which China has created is a long term one, and other countries probably should have been smarter and not just walk blindly into this. But now that we are in this situation in 2025, I think the emergence of the awareness is at least welcome.
So that's a very sobering look at the challenges ahead, and the idea of this, the new colonialism adds also a very critical lens to how we also view this kind of a partnership. So now let us connect this back to something what we explored in our first episode, that is water. While rare earth, earth minerals dominate discussion, but water remains a very critical resource in Asia. So, do you see any parallels between China's approach to extractive diplomacy and its management of transboundary water resources? Can this framework help us understand China's hydro behavior, especially with the upstream control over all the major rivers which are coming from the Tibet? What are your take?
Hmm. Again, very interesting question. And China's extractive diplomacy, which is traditionally associated with its dominance in rare earth elements and critical minerals, it shares significant parallels with its approach to transboundary water resources. As the upstream controller of major Asian rivers like the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, and the Indus, China leverages its hydro hegemony to exert economic, geopolitical, and environmental influence, particularly over downstream South and Southeast Asian countries. And this approach aligns with extractive diplomacy framework, wherein control over a critical resource, in this case water, is used to secure strategic advantages. Just to give you a linkage, let's look at this indicator, resource control as a strategic leverage. If you look at, say, minerals as the resource, China, as I said, has a dominance in rare earth elements, and that allows it to manipulate supply chains, as we've seen in the 2025 export restrictions on certain rare earth elements that has disrupted industries in India and in other parts of the world, right? Now, if you look at this particular resource as water, as the upstream riparian state for rivers like the Mekong or the Brahmaputra, China controls water flow through dams and through infrastructure. There are 11 dams on the Mekong. There are plans for 20 more. That gives it the ability to regulate water availability for downstream countries like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, right? So all the approach is to control the resource, right, and not to share it. Generally, I'm going into a bit of theory, but the thing is, in the 21st century, it was itself as a particular actor in international relations, which deeply cares for multipolarity, sharing of resources, comparative advantages, and so on. But when you look closely at what it does with the resources it geographically has been bestowed with, be it water, be it rare earth elements, it clearly controls it. And it will only allow usage when it gets a lot of things in return from the other countries, right? So both minerals and water, they are critical resources. China uses them to create dependency. Um, in minerals, China's resource for infrastructure deals like those in the DRC for cobalt, they secure long-term mineral supplies while fostering economic dependency through debt. In the case of water, China uses infrastructure to gain geopolitical leverage. For example, the $1.5 billion worth of investment in Laos's Nam O hydropower project, which is part of the BRI, ensures Chinese control over the Mekong tributaries while making Laos get even more indebted. Similarly, withholding Brahmaputra flow, be it during 2017 and other years, it signals geopolitical coercion. So both strategies involve using resource control to extract concessions, be it political alignment or access to other resources. And China has asymmetric relationships, and fortunately for China, unfortunately for other countries of the world, um, partnerships often favor China's interests. Host countries which are exporting raw materials while China dominates high value processing often are at the receiving end. Even in the case of water, that is exactly the case. China maintains the upper hand, limits the downstream countries' autonomy. Bangladesh's reliance on Brahmaputra, for example, for 30% of its water supply, mirrors India's dependence on China's rare earth elements. Both are vulnerable to supply distortions. So, this sort of a control and usage is pretty much the same, be it minerals or be it water. So, yeah, pretty sad note to end my answer with, but that's how it is.
That's really tying, all things together, and seeing water and mineral through the same lens of strategic control is very incredibly thought provoking. From rare art to rivers, you have really helped us to unpack the layers of China's extractive diplomacy and what it means for Asia and beyond. Thank you, Dr. Pathak, for making this complex dynamic so easy and so, accessible and compelling to understand. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this second episode of Understanding Asian Hydropolitics. If you found our today's discussion engaging, stay tuned for our more continued upcoming episodes. Till then, stay tuned. Thank you so much.